Well, just so that we're entirely transparent, I want you to know I've known this man for 26 years and followed his career as he's worked for Republicans and Democrats in the White House, in the State Department, and in the intelligence community. And we're really honored, Nick, that you were able to take some time out of your, what I know is ridiculous schedule. I know this means you'll probably work till 10 o'clock tonight to make up for it, so thank you for coming.
The other thing that was left out of the introduction, in addition to our 26-year history, is the fact that Dick hired me out of graduate school 26 years ago. So,
well, everybody makes a mistake now.
So we have a history.
So you've been doing national security for 26 years, but for the last 16, really, since 9/11, you've been doing counterterrorism either in the White House or in the intelligence community. That's a long time, a lot longer than I did it. And I wonder if you can look back over those 16 years, if you put yourself back into December 2001, which was a traumatic time for all of us. Literally, we were traumatized. And how has the role of the terrorism professional changed? What are you working on now that didn't exist then? Just give us a short, take 16 years and tell us about it in 5 minutes.
Sure. Well, a lot of things have changed over that time. I think in terms of the threat landscape that we are dealing with and that we're managing, that has changed pretty significantly. And a lot of that change, I think, has been telescoped into the last few years with the emergence of Isil, Daesh, and the particular set of innovations that they brought to the terrorist playbook. We can go into that separately. But I think much of the period after 9/11, in the first several years, and maybe the first decade after 9/11, we were still very, very focused as an intelligence community and as a counterterrorism community, focused on groups and the effort by known terrorist organizations to carry out organized plotting, often complex, often aimed at carrying out at generating mass casualties or generating catastrophic effect. And that the effort much of the effort of our intelligence community and of our diplomatic, military, and intelligence personnel was focused on defeating that threat.
So you're looking for another 9/11?
Exactly.
For a repeat?
Exactly. And by all accounts, that was what Al-Qaeda was trying to do to us. Right. And so it was no accident that was where the weight of our effort was. And
they did in London and
exactly.
Bali and Madrid.
Exactly. And what has probably shifted the terrorism landscape more than anything else over the last 2 to 3 years has been the significant diversification of that threat landscape. That threat landscape still includes all of what I've just described, the idea that a terrorist organization might carry out a complex attack with a gestation period of many, many months or even years, the way 9/11 was. But we are also now dealing with a threat landscape that is populated with many, many more extremists and potential terrorists than at any point in our history. And each of those terrorists might, on his or her own, find and take the opportunity to carry out their own little terrorist attack in their own location using whatever resources are available to them. And so that becomes a different problem to be solved because one, the set of tools you would use to disable and disrupt that individual are a lot different than the set of tools you would use to go after an Al-Qaeda senior leadership resident in the tribal areas of Pakistan, for example. And I guess what I would say is what's made it particularly challenging for us in the intelligence community and in the counterterrorism community is that the latter phenomenon, that lone actor phenomenon, is proving to be additive. It is coming on top of, not at the expense of or in lieu of that other plotting.
Yeah, so you have to worry about both.
You have to worry about both. You stretch capabilities thinner.
Yep.
you take analysts away from topics where the threat hasn't gone away, it just simply has been shoved aside a little bit as other threat vectors have risen to the fore. And so I can't remember the last time we had something kind of fall off the plate as not being of concern anymore, something you could take your felt tip pen and just cross off the list and say, not a problem.
Yep.
It keeps becoming additive.
It gets bigger. But if you go back to when you started in 2001 on terrorism, counterterrorism, our worry then was Al-Qaeda. And over the course of many years, Al-Qaeda has been significantly eroded. I know that if you look at the pictures in the White House Situation Room on the night that bin Laden was killed, this guy is standing there behind the president. You did a lot of damage to Al-Qaeda, but it's still alive.
It
Right?
is.
Is it?
It is. And one of the things, I'm often given the opportunity to testify in front of the Congress.
There's such a great opportunity too, isn't it?
And
I always love that.
And I get a couple of very structured opportunities to do that every year alongside Director Comey and Secretary Jay Johnson of Homeland Security. We testify in front of a number of different committees to describe the homeland threat picture that we face. And as you can imagine, in recent years, that has been an ISIS or ISIL-driven conversation, both in our testimony, but also in the kind of range of questions that come at us from the members of Congress. But in my testimony, and certainly in the actual conversation with the members, I go to great lengths to try to bring them back to the question of Al-Qaeda, so that we don't lose sight of the fact that we are still facing a pretty significant Al-Qaeda threat.
Is it one that's, in the old Al-Qaeda was, we shorthanded it by calling it Al-Qaeda Central.
Right.
Which was in Afghanistan and Pakistan, and was very hierarchical. I mean, there was a Shura council with a limited number of people. We knew who those people were. Most of them are no longer alive. But there's a new Shura council, one hears. Is it still a hierarchical organization with central control?
Yes and no. I mean, there's no doubt but that Al-Qaeda's senior leadership structure has adapted and evolved over time. It is now not so exclusively focused on the tribal areas of Pakistan. It involves senior leaders from various Al-Qaeda affiliate organizations, to include those operating on the Arabian Peninsula, AQAP, to include those operating in North Africa, AQIM, Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, to include those operating in Syria, Jabhat al-Nusra, or as we talk about it often in the intelligence community, Al-Qaeda operating in Syria. Right. And so what you have—
They keep changing their name in Syria.
And we've written several memos inside the intelligence community just trying to literally get our hands around a consistent nomenclature, because it's such a challenge. But my point is what you have is the center of gravity of that Al-Qaeda leadership shifting beyond South Asia and perhaps becoming, over time, more Levant-centric. I wouldn't say that that's a light switch that has flipped entirely. That is something that may be happening over time.
But these cells in Africa and increasingly further south in Africa, in Yemen and Syria, there's a connectivity?
There's a degree of communication between Al-Qaeda nodes and affiliates that perhaps didn't exist earlier, because before it would go back to the center and then back out from the center. Now that kind of communication can look much more spaghetti-like in the way those connections are being maintained. And that's not just a function of the way the leadership is functioning, but it's also, I think, just a recognition of what is true over time. Terrorists who've been operating in this clandestine network for well over 15 or 20 years have pretty full Rolodexes and know how to maintain ties to each other, even if they are occupying, expanses of geography pretty far away from each other. So there is a less tightly controlled, or a less tightly structured command and control arrangement than perhaps we saw in the immediate aftermath of 9/11.
But they're still out there. And Zawahiri, who is the titular head, who took over after bin Laden was killed, he's still out there somewhere. And one hears that he's trying to build another Al-Qaeda branch in the subcontinent, and this is mainly Pakistan in the slums of Karachi. And do we worry about that?
We do, because obviously if an Al-Qaeda branch operating in South Asia can again prove capable of carrying out significant attacks against Pakistani or Afghan interests or against Western interests in South Asia, then that will contribute to the effort to restore Al-Qaeda to its what they believe is their rightful position at the forefront of the global jihad.
So we need to worry about Pakistan.
So we need to worry about that. For me, as an amateur analyst, and I say that because even though I lead an intelligence organization, I'm not a career intelligence analyst, but I don't think it's too much of a reach to say that there's a bit of a pivot point that will come for Al-Qaeda when Ayman al-Zawahiri is ultimately gone from the movement, whether he dies a natural death or is killed in a counterterrorism operation.
Hopefully the latter.
So that pivot point, will the center of gravity that I described earlier completely migrate outside of South Asia, focus on other safe havens, potentially the safe haven of greatest concern obviously being in the Levant right now, or will this distributed architecture that I described persist?
So Al-Qaeda was always focused on what they called the far enemy, which was us. That seems to be less the case in the last 5 years or so.
Again, I'd say yes and no. I mean, if you look at particular Al-Qaeda nodes, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, for example, obviously the political turmoil in Yemen, the fact that you have very difficult circumstances in Yemen right now in terms of the effort to create a unitary state. Al-Qaeda operating in Yemen is certainly looking to take advantage of that. Their priority, though, I would argue that their priority continues to be to try to carry out attacks against Western targets and potentially including even the homeland. And what's become more difficult over the last 2 to 3 years as the situation in Yemen has deteriorated, it's become more difficult for us to operate in Yemen and collect the kinds of intelligence that we would need to get out ahead of that. Right. So just the fact that you don't read about it as much as you used to when you would read about aviation plotting emanating from Yemen, the Christmas Day bomber in 2009.
Doesn't mean it's not happening.
Doesn't mean it's not there. Doesn't mean that the leadership doesn't aspire to do just exactly that. It just means that we face a much tougher intelligence challenge in collecting that intelligence and getting ahead of that.
Al-Qaeda in Yemen seems to be doing a very different approach toward governance, because it had some cities there for a while in Yemen, still has some territory. And their approach to governance as compared to Daesh was more participatory, taking into account the concerns of the community, whereas Daesh was much more imposing from the top down.
I think that's right. I think there was always an effort on the part of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula to kind of take advantage of the fact that they were operating inside a very traditional Yemeni tribal structure and to seek to capitalize on that.
I think they provide some services that the government couldn't.
I think over time they realized that the burden of running a quasi-state in even portions of Yemeni territory was a burden they didn't necessarily want to bear, and it became more of a burden than a boon, particularly as it drained resources away from other parts of the organization that they might want to exploit to carry out the kind of external plotting I'm talking about. But that was in an atmosphere where the Yemeni state was a unitary state, and now we can't say that. So I think right now, along with our Gulf partners, we're trying very, very hard to make sure that AQAP, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, doesn't find a way to control territory in that way again.
Yeah. Well, I suspect everybody in the audience thought we'd start out talking about Daesh. Nick calls it Isil because the administration, and only the US administration, calls it Isil. So let's go there. Let's talk about them. They were an incredible phenomenon, seemingly coming out of nowhere, taking over several cities, large cities in Libya, in Iraq, in Syria, probably ruled millions of people at one point in time. It seems like the operations in Iraq, steady, systematic, are eroding their control of cities. Mosul seems to be going faster maybe than the Iraqis had thought. And Secretary Carter says we're beginning to make shaping operations, whatever that means, around Raqqa in Syria. Let's assume for the sake of argument that this time, 3 months from now, 6 months from now, they don't control any of those big cities. How does that change the nature of the threat, and how does it change the nature of their raison d'etre, of their organization?
So in terms of the threat that Daesh, ISIL represents, particularly to us here in the United States, and I would argue more broadly to the West, does not change in the near term simply as a result of territorial setbacks inflicted upon Daesh. And that's something I've spoken openly about in public testimony, and we've talked about pretty openly. Over the last 18 months to 2 years, ISIL has devoted significant effort to creating a capability to carry out external operations, to look beyond Iraq and Syria and look to carry out operations against members of the coalition, Western targets, whatever you want to identify as the target set.
Does it need a safe haven for that external capability to work?
And that's the point. That network that has been created will survive, or will certainly still exist, even if the immediate safe haven they enjoy right now is disrupted. Now, we're spending a lot of time thinking and analyzing and assessing what happens to that network. Do those do individuals who flowed to the region, to the conflict zone, return to their places of origin, be that Western Europe, be that the Gulf, be that North Africa? Do they look to move to another safe haven that could serve as kind of a center of gravity for ISIL? I think there was some thought that, at least in some circles, that Libya might be that place at an earlier stage. I don't know that I would argue that at present. But in my mind, the specific question of external plotting, of the ability of ISIL leaders to reach out and organize and deploy and activate individuals to carry out attacks of the sort you saw in Brussels, in Paris, or to inspire individuals to carry out the kinds of attacks you've seen even here in the United States, that doesn't go away simply because physical location has been disrupted. It will certainly make the project harder. So the territorial success, I don't want to minimize that. The territorial success that the coalition and the Iraqi government is having against Mosul, and ultimately the coalition and other partners that hopefully will have against Raqqa, is a necessary but not sufficient condition for addressing that threat environment that we're dealing with.
It damages their brand, I would think, right?
It damages their brand, and you certainly can make the argument that it will reduce their ability to attract, motivate, and recruit foreign fighters. And as you know, the foreign fighter pipeline had been on a pretty steep upward curve for a long time.
And maybe their money.
But again, even if you posited, just for the sake of argument, that today the flow of foreign fighters stops right this minute, there's still a pretty big pool upon which to draw if you're an ISIL external operations plotter and you're looking to set some kind of plotting in motion. So when we've talked about this publicly, I've tried to talk about a kind of a lag effect, that it will take a period of time, and I can't define what that period of time is, but it'll take a period of time before the success that we're having collectively on the ground against Daesh in shrinking the size of the territory controlled by Daesh, before that translates into true shrinkage of the external threat that the group poses.
Is there a risk that because they've lost metropolitan areas and their brand is damaged by that, is there a risk that they think they have to do something in the West to compensate for that? so that they prove they're still alive and well?
You know, there was a little bit of an analytic debate about this going back several months when the territorial reverses first started to accumulate. And you had some people, you know, even saying publicly, well, now that they are suffering setbacks, they will pivot and start looking to do spectacular things outside of Iraq and Syria in order to burnish the brand and make, you know, keep themselves relevant, sustain the notion that they are somehow winning. We never really bought that in the intelligence community because I think we had already concluded that Daesh, Isil, was an organization that was moving down the path of wanting to carry out those kinds of Western attacks.
If they could do it, they're going to do
If
it.
they
It
could
doesn't
do it.
matter.
And I think at an earlier stage, we might have thought of it as being more sequential. First, they will try to establish the caliphate and stabilize and solidify their hold on territory. And then at a later stage, they will look to advance the global jihadist effort by carrying out these kind of external attacks, more sequential. Well, those sequences kind of collapsed into each other. I think if we were, I pushed back on the idea that we were caught by surprise on many things involving Daesh or ISIL as an intelligence community, because I think we're on record as doing a pretty good job of describing the growth of the organization and the threat it posed to institutions in Iraq. If there was something that we thought we may have had more time on than we ultimately proved to, it was that Western plotting agenda, which I think came upon us more quickly than we perhaps anticipated. That pool of foreign fighters from European countries, even including from the United States, we thought would be for a long time on the ground fighting in the conflict zone.
And they trained them and send them back.
And then someday,
they trained them and send them back very quickly.
that has happened more quickly. And then, again, this is where even some of our success has worked against us in that fighters who would have sought to go to the conflict zone a year ago or 2 years ago now find that a much harder project.
They're even telling them, stay home.
Yeah, exactly. The amount of effort it takes, the amount of work that Western countries have put into the project of preventing that travel now leaves those individuals in the position of staying at home, and they've received guidance, as you said, Dick, to carry out whatever action you can using whatever tools you have within your reach. And so in some ways, that has brought kind of the homeland threat picture into a little sharper relief than it might have been if all these individuals were simply traveling to the conflict zone.
So when you think about the homeland in Europe as a theater of operations for Daesh or Al-Qaeda, what we at MEI spend a lot of time thinking about is this notion of counter-messaging, the battle of ideas, the war of ideas, which collectively is now under the heading CVE, Countering Violent Extremism. It seems to be working in some places, not working in others. Do you get the impression that there's a systematic network among Western governments that's sharing best practices? And let me leave it there.
I think the way you frame the question is pretty much a diagnosis of what we're seeing. One of the things we as a community, as an intelligence community, have concluded about countering violent extreme CVE efforts is that success is often a very localized phenomenon. What works in one environment, whether it's a metropolitan area or a village or a country or any one place, what works in one area is not necessarily guaranteed to work in any other area, and that I break it in my own mind into thinking about the work we do at home on this problem here inside the United States and the work we and our partners are trying to do overseas on this. But the common thread across both of those landscapes is that it looks different, success looks different almost everywhere you look.
But there are successes.
But there are successes. They tend to be in pockets, places you can point to and say, aha, that is working well. Mm-hmm. When it is working well, some of the common themes that we seem to have drawn from those success stories is involvement of local stakeholders, actual community organizations who can deliver services, do in a sense case management on the ground is essential to success.
It depends on the community itself organizing.
Exactly, and so here in the United States, a federal government set of programs that will be foisted upon a community won't work. So I think what we've concluded is we can do the most good by providing information and analysis, which allows communities to know what they are dealing with, to be able to spot at an early stage and hopefully conduct their own versions of intervention, involving community leaders, religious leaders, educational leaders, and do so in an effort to get out ahead of law enforcement, get to the point where this is not a problem where the FBI has had to open a case on an individual and is now employing all of the investigative tools of the FBI. Because if we're at that point, chances are we're past the point where this is a collaboration effort between community and government, and it's much more at that point what are you doing to my son, arresting my son. So
there's a sort of civil liberties issue here. And I know you struggle, I've struggled with maintaining our belief system in civil liberties and also doing counterterrorism. I know the worst thing for counterterrorism is to track the radicalized individual who is simply exercising his own rights of freedom of expression, and wondering when is the switch going to flip to when that person is going to go violent. And the former state is legal, acceptable. There are lots of people who have radicalized views. And you can't tell when that switch is going to be flipped. And you don't know when, and when they switch that, flip that switch in their own mind, it may be a day or two before they do something.
Well, at NCTC, the National Counterterrorism Center, my team at NCTC contributes to our CVE efforts in two ways. One of them, the first of them, is kind of the foundational analysis, analytical work that helps us understand just that process. How does a person move from being a consumer, but a passive consumer, of extremist material in an online environment or in some other environment?
Which is legal.
Which is legal. And actually, we wouldn't have the resources as an intelligence community or as law enforcement to follow everybody who consumes extremist material, even if we had the desire to do that. But the kind of the study that the way we have looked at it, that process of transformation from simply passive consumption to mobilization to violence to actually taking an overt act, what we've learned is that there is no single one pathway or timeline that tells you when things will be triggered. But if there is a common factor, and I think we've working along with FBI, some of the experts in the behavioral analysis world at FBI, and with our own social scientists, including psychologists at my organization, one of the things we've determined is that in the vast majority of the cases of homegrown violent extremists who have moved in that direction and ultimately looked to carry something violent out, there was one common factor, and that common factor was that there was a bystander. There was somebody along the way who, upon reflection in the aftermath, said, I actually did think something was not right. I actually did wonder if that person was headed in a wrong direction. And then in some cases, that person says, I wish I had done something. In some cases, that person says, I don't know what I could have done, because if the only option might have appeared to be calling the police or the FBI, that's not always a palatable option for a family member. But that bystander phenomenon is, I think, the insight that is giving us the kind of the directional pointer for how to do domestic CVE here in the United States. If we can find ways to empower with information people who might fit into that bystander category, a coach, a teacher, a colleague, a friend, a cousin, an uncle, a parent.
And if there's someone they can go to other than the FBI.
Exactly. And
that's a big jump.
And that is a big jump. And I think right now, if there's an area which needs the most development in the CVE realm, it's how do we construct intervention models that work, intervention models that allow a community to kind of sit around a conference table and figure out who's got the right set of tools to react to this person's potential move towards extremism. Again, is that a social service provider? Is that a religious organization? Is that an NGO that has sprung up and is doing great work to try to play in this arena? And from my perspective, sitting in Washington, the thing we're lacking right now is resources, because I think a lot of those things take money, and so the more we can do to resource community organizations that are going to be positive players, the better. But the other thing we're lacking, and I think we're trying to address it, is who is the natural quarterback for that conversation, or the convener, so that when somebody comes to the attention of local authorities who might fit into this category of being someone who might act, who calls the meeting and says, let's sit around the table?
Right.
You know, it's unfair to ask FBI in some ways to be that, provider of social services.
Ideally, it's the imam or someone in the community, but you can't always count on that. So the British are doing a lot of work in this field too, and it looks like they're getting some progress. Generally, when you look at the European response to Daesh, most of the external Daesh activity has been in Europe, and it's been horrific. The Europeans, I don't know, from an outside perspective, the Europeans look a little ragged in their response.
I love the leading questions where.
That was just a comment. It wasn't even a question.
Well, there's no question but that Europe is facing a terrorism environment and landscape that is dramatically different than it was 2 years ago. And so while we've always had strong, effective counterterrorism partnerships with a handful of European countries with whom we work very closely on all intelligence matters, it wasn't the case that we had kind of a across the continent counterterrorism effort kind of woven together with all of the partners working together. And that's kind of what's required now.
Yeah. They don't seem to be talking to each other either.
And again, I think you can think about this at a couple different levels. There's the kind of the baseline challenge of just sharing intelligence information among security services of different countries. And that, I think, generally moves and works pretty well when it's in bilateral channels. The harder, or the wider the group, the harder it gets. And especially when countries are asked to share information on their nationals, that becomes a sensitive topic and something they only want to do in the smallest, tightest of groups. So that kind of information sharing, I think, is happening pretty effectively, though not without some challenges. The harder thing is something that we had to address ourselves in the wake of 9/11, and that is how do you move information across the divide between law enforcement organizations and intelligence organizations.
Within one government.
Within one government.
Yeah.
And there are some cases I've seen where partners have shared information with us because they knew we would feed it to somewhere else, even in their own system, that they couldn't.
Yeah, sounds familiar.
Just as an elaborate, or not so elaborate, workaround of their own legal structures and parameters. And so, it took 9/11 for us to break down the wall between law enforcement and intelligence information. And obviously Europe hasn't experienced anything on that scale. And I think among kind of the group of career professional security officers who are in positions of leadership, they get that that's an imperative right now, but finding the ways for their parliaments or their legislatures to kind of catch up and enable that kind of sharing of information, that may take time. And again, I was saying to Dick when we were having a conversation beforehand, when you think about even in the United States, the fact that it took us 5, 10, and now 15 years after 9/11, just inside the United States, to rationalize the sharing of information among the federal government with the state and local governments that we work with day in and day out. One can only imagine how much harder it is in a European environment where they are working in a Schengen system, where they have one common border, where they have federal authorities, state authorities, a European Parliament to deal with, a European Council to deal with. The number of institutions involved in decision-making is just that much more.
And much higher protections for privacy rights and civil liberties.
Exactly.
In some countries.
Exactly. Though that is ground I'm reluctant to cede sometimes, because that somehow implies we Americans don't ourselves value civil liberties and protection of civil rights in the same way that, you know, and to be lectured in that regard sometimes is a little bit.
Yeah. No, having at President Obama's request reviewed the internal procedures at NSA, I can assure you it's very, very difficult to get permission for NSA to get permission to monitor an American. Well, this is great, and you and I could go on for 5 hours, but if we did, we'd have to open a beer. So I know there are people in the audience who are dying to ask you questions. So we've got 2 microphones, I think. Am I right? There's certainly one here. If you'd line up, and if you could, please state your name and if you have an affiliation before you ask the question. And try to make it a question and not a speech. If you make it a speech, I'll cut you off. Do we just have this one? I guess. Okay. Yes, sir.
The mic.
Can we get the sound on this mic? Try again.
That works.
Emrullah Huslu from Virginia International University. By training, I'm a Turkish terrorism expert. I'm wondering, in the Middle East, in recent years, some politicians are using anti-Americanism as for domestic purposes. I was wondering whether you see any correlation between anti-American political rhetoric and jihadism, direct correlation between these two phenomena. Thank you.
Well, I'm not sure I would restrict it narrowly to anti-American rhetoric. I think to the degree that there are anti-Western or anti-coalition kind of themes being put out by government leaders in a particular country, yes, that can kind of spur people to, particularly if those individuals are predisposed to hold those views anyway. I mean, obviously the Daesh narrative, as does the Al-Qaeda narrative, kind of hinges pretty dramatically on the kind of nefarious way in which U.S. foreign policy is portrayed, our objectives in the Middle East, our objectives with respect to the Muslim world more broadly. And so to the extent, I mean, I think as we think about our own counterterrorism actions, we're always conscious of not doing anything to contribute to that narrative in ways that we don't have to.
Which is hard.
Which is hard.
I mean, it's particularly when you're relying on drone activities. Sometimes one makes mistakes. If you weren't using drones, if you were using something else, it would be a lot worse.
And I think that the questions of hard power versus soft power are always challenging when you're talking about trying to affect the narrative that terrorist organizations are using against us. But I would just urge that when people think this through, there's usually a trade-off involved, and that trade-off is one that's always going to look a little differently to an administration who feels like its first obligation is to prevent specific acts of terror from being launched against Americans, and either in the homeland or in serving or living overseas. And so
that's the burden. The burden that I felt, the burden that you feel every night, is what mistake have I made? What did I overlook? What did I not know about that's going to cause me to wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning with a phone call that some horrific attack has just occurred? That weighs on you, and that's your most important driver.
And it does create a bias in favor of action when you believe you have sound information on which to base that action.
Absolutely. Next question.
Yes, Roy Gutman. I'm a freelance journalist based in Turkey. Two questions about Syria. Is there any relationship, to your mind, between the government of Syria and Daesh? They've been operating since 2013 pretty much with impunity in Syria. They've got a safe haven in Raqqa, even to this day, from the government. The government's almost never bombed them, even when they had the black flags up in front of the governorate offices there. An awful lot of Syrians at every level, including a lot of defected senior intelligence people, say that there is a relationship, and they say, in fact, that the government has penetrated Daesh. Do you think that that's true? And the second question relates to something that's been in the news the last couple of days. That is the what's it called? The Jaish Fatah al-Sham, the successor organization to al-Nusra. The U.S. government seems to contend that they are plotting in Syria against international targets, and probably including the United States, and that the Khorasan group is there and active. But I don't know any Syrians in this group people that I'm mentioning here, or even outsiders who know very much about anything, that have seen any sign that JFAS is actually doing these plotting. So can you comment on that?
Good questions. We got them.
Okay, the first one's kind of easy to answer because I'm not aware of any information that would suggest a Daesh. I think
it's a conspiracy theory that's out there. Now, we never, those of us who work in the Middle East, we never have conspiracy theories. But occasionally one slips into the Middle East. And there's a conspiracy theory that because they don't bomb Raqqa, they're busy using all their bombers somewhere else, but that's the theory.
With respect to the second set of questions about Jabhat al-Nusra, the kind of the renaming of the organization, and to what degree the organization may be outwardly focused on plotting against the West, or at least actors outside Syria. I think we've been pretty clear about saying that the renaming and the reorganizing and the rebranding is simply that, a fairly transparent effort to hide the ball on the fact that this particular set of actors, yes, be they Syrian opposition as they are, also view themselves, or at least leadership views themselves, very much as being a part of the al-Qaeda global movement. And so, and we know plenty about what the aspirations are of al-Qaeda in terms of its global agenda. And I'm not trying to simplify it and make it sound like I'm painting with one insanely broad brush. I just think it's just a matter of logic. Now, you could make the argument that there's a prioritization process going on in which the organization has to devote resources to advancing their agenda as an opposition organization going after the Assad regime, trying to bring down Assad, and how that stacks up in the kind of daily racking and stacking of priorities that they have alongside the priority.
But they do have an external.
But they do have an external operations agenda. And I can't say much more than that without getting into areas I can't. But it is something we worry about and watch pretty closely.
Mohammed Al-Shwaiter, Fulbright Fellow from Yemen. My question is, it seems like the counterterrorism is focused only or mainly in the intelligence and military operations. It seems like it's missing the the narratives. It's fighting the extremism after they've been recruited or been a member of these groups. How do you value the contribution of Arab Muslim countries in the Middle East of countering the narratives of the countering the narrative of the radical groups? Thank you.
It's a good question, and I mean, how do we value it? I think it receives maximum value from those of us in the counterterrorism profession, because from our perspective, the more if we could achieve greater effect in the effort to prevent radicalization, we certainly would be dealing with much less of a terrorism problem than we are. I think what we have found, though, at least this is me speaking personally, is that when you're sitting in Washington and you're trying to devise strategies to try to deal with the problem of extremism in a foreign country, sometimes the tools we have are fairly limited. And so our best opportunities in most cases come from empowering governments in the region to do more themselves.
Empowering and hectoring. I mean, you're also saying to some of them, you're not doing enough.
Yeah, exactly. And again, there's a short-term, long-term problem here, because the kind of programming that goes on all across our government in areas outside of the intelligence community that supports these kinds of efforts is usually not programming that has near-term payoff. The kinds of programs that we as Americans can support in countries where extremism is a problem are usually tied to good governance, rule of law, I hesitate to say democratization, but focused on rule of law and good governance as a means of decreasing the attractiveness of the extremist narrative.
But he asked about messaging, counter-messaging. Is the U.S. government any good at counter-messaging?
Again, this is an area where my 15 years of experience that you hearkened, or you hailed in the intro, Dick, kind of gives me a great deal of humility and modesty about how well we do this. And so we seem to have much greater success when we find partners who we can enable and empower rather than dealing with this with a U.S. government brand on it.
Well, that's probably a mature U.S. response, right?
But unfortunately, anytime you are working through partners, it's things don't move as quickly as you would like. Yeah. You don't achieve results as quickly as you would like. It's harder to demonstrate where, action by us has resulted in success over here. So it ends up being important but frustrating work.
So messaging is important, but we look to our allies and partners to do a lot of
exactly
the spade work.
Thank you both for a great discussion. My name is David Russell. I'm an intern at the Middle East Institute. So my question also regards Jaish Fatah Hashem and kind of the debate over whether it's focused more on the near enemy now than it is on the far enemy. Because I think that it really does represent a shift in Al-Qaeda's mentality from focusing on the far enemy, being a more internationally based and internationally focused organization, with the rebranding of Jabhat al-Nusra as Jaish Fatah Hashem. It's abandoning its international ties to Al-Qaeda, at least officially, and with Al-Qaeda's approval, to integrate itself better with the local actors in the Syrian revolution. So at least in the short term, it seems like they are focused more on the near enemy. And so what do you think the reasons are for this shift? Why have they shifted more towards focusing on the near enemy, focusing on local goals and local actors? And does it have anything to do perhaps with the rise of ISIS and is an attempt to distinguish themselves from the Islamic State?
Again, I guess I don't necessarily buy 100% the premise of the question because, again, the rebranding of the organization to me does not represent a fundamental change in its objectives. It simply speaks to prioritization in the kind of near and medium term. And so this is, it's hard for me to say much more about this because this is a really challenging and difficult intelligence question that we're spending a lot of time trying to gain greater fidelity on. And I'll just kind of leave it there. We are spending a lot of time trying to figure out where the threats of greatest concern, the threats of greatest imminence emanate from. And as you know, I talked about it earlier, we already face a very difficult and acute threat environment tied to Daesh. And so it's important that we not kind of lose sight of other, especially Al-Qaeda-linked threat activity that could come our way. So, from a resource perspective, it would be easy to say, aha, that stuff tied to Al-Qaeda operating in Syria is an over-the-horizon problem because they're focused on, in the near term, on dealing with the regime.
But
so let's not worry about it.
But you can't say that.
But we could wake up one day and find that
right.
picture had flipped,
right.
that switch had flipped overnight.
It was a fairly transparent rebranding. I mean, did they really think that just by changing their name we would think they were different? Nothing else happened. It's like they took the sign down and anyway.
Mustafa Malik, I'm a journalist and researcher here in Washington. My question is about the source or sources of terrorism. During the colonial era and immediate aftermath, America was the only good Western country in many Muslim countries because American presidents criticized European colonialism. France and Britain were hated universally. So what's happened during the last 30 years or so that suddenly in the same societies, anti-Americanism and anti-American terrorism has spiked. Has something happened to the Quran, madrasas, and Islam? Or American policy has something to do that contributes to it? Thank you.
Why don't I answer that?
Yeah.
I think it's difficult to ask an administration official to criticize American policy. So let me take that one. Look, it's obviously the answer to your question is both. You know, both a radicalization in some of the countries involved here, where there was an increased program of teaching a radical view of Islam. And an overt attempt to spread that radical view. And it succeeded. In addition to which, there were American responses to things that happened in the region and things that happened to the United States that provoked resentment, beginning with the first Gulf War. The fact that the United States dropped 500,000 troops on the Arabian Peninsula to save an Arab country that had been invaded and occupied. But nonetheless, the fact that 500,000 US troops showed up created some resentment in some quarters. After 9/11, some of the tactics that were used by the United States were very counterproductive and certainly fueled further terrorism. So I think the answer to your question is both.
My name is Hani Eldib. I'm an educator and a consultant of Egyptian American origins. My question is, during the elections, Mr. Trump advocated a claim that is very popular actually in Arab countries, which is that President Obama and Secretary Clinton founded Daesh actually. And before that, Secretary Clinton said, I think in a briefing to Congress, that President Reagan founded Al-Qaeda. So there is a belief, in the Arab countries that actually the United States is the one who founded, these terrorist organizations. And then we are fighting them at the same time. So the question is it a matter of one branch of the government creating terrorist organizations and then the other branch fighting them? Or is our anti-terrorist fight not credible, really? I mean, how do you see that?
You'll not be surprised to find that during a period of transition, I will be choosing words carefully.
I think let me rephrase the question.
But even as a matter of intelligence, I don't think we ever looked at Daesh as being formed in some way as an outgrowth of anything, any steps that the United States.
Well, we know who created Al-Qaeda. We know where they created it and when they created it. We know who created Daesh, when and where. And they were not anywhere connected to the United States. And again, the Middle East is a great place for conspiracy theories. And it's incredible to me sometimes how many people in the Middle East fall for these, what I would call wackadoodle theories. But they do, and even some very senior people do. We need to get away from the absence of facts in our analysis and try to be more fact-based. And when we see conspiracy theories like that, we just need to, all of us have an obligation to shut them down because there's just nothing about those theories that's true. Sorry.
Peter Humphrey, I'm an analyst, a broadcaster, and a former diplomat. My tremendous fear is that the Clausewitzian center of gravity of the jihadist problem is the Quran itself. There's 100 profoundly bad sentences in there, and anybody who abides by every sentence in the Quran is a jihadist. And my fear is that we will be stuck with this problem until we find a way to address this Clausewitzian center of gravity. So I'm wondering, how do we get the rest of Islam to sort of ignore the 100 sentences? And why isn't the CIA and the State Department engaged in information operations that quote other portions of the Quran to try and negate these horrible passages within the book.
Well, I'm not going to speak about what information operations the CIA may or may not be engaged in, but I guess what I would say is, without necessarily granting the premise of the question, I will say that one of the things we're thinking about inside the government is post-Daesh, just as there was a post-core al-Qaeda, now Daesh is at the forefront of this problem that we're dealing with, and there will be a post-Daesh period, and there may be some other form of extremist or terrorist movement that takes the fore in the broader Sunni world. We don't know what that is yet, but my question that I've asked our analysts to think about is there an end point to the arc of Sunni-tied extremist ideology? Is there something about it that naturally contains the seeds of its own destruction so that it ultimately consumes itself like fire and burns itself out? Or is it something so tied so tightly to political and social conditions in a part of the world that is struggling with change that we're going to be dealing with it for decades, if not generations? That's a big analytical question, and it's a question we're asking not just to inform or help inform the incoming administration's counterterrorism strategies, but just to help us think about this as a problem. Is this, we've talked about it as being a generational problem, something we're going to be dealing with for a long time, but what do we mean by that? And so I don't expect out of this analysis will come immediate prescriptions, but I think at least reaching some judgments about whether this is a problem that's even subject to intervention from outside, if you will.
Yeah, it gets back to the old question of is terrorism caused by socio-economic conditions, poverty, unemployment, lack of participation in government, or is it caused by beliefs, religious beliefs, misinterpretations of the Quran and whatnot?
They're not really misinterpretations. I mean, they're pretty clear.
I don't want to debate it, but the question is, there's an ideological element, and then there's the sociological economic argument. And when we looked at the 9/11 terrorists, they were not people who were suffering socioeconomic deprivation. They were sort of upper middle class. Now when we look at the whole body of terrorism, we find some poor people, some upper middle class people. It seems to be, so the argument that it's just ideology, I think probably isn't true. But also the argument that it's because of poverty and political exclusion probably isn't true either. It's a combination sometimes.
And again, we've studied this more intently with the more accessible population to us, which is the number of homegrown violent extremists that I talked about earlier when I talked about the bystander phenomenon. And unfortunately, that looking at that population, the kind of mix of factors to include everything you just described, Dick, but also mental health, family situation, the stew ends up being a little bit different in almost every case. And so picking out what the causal element was.
It's pretty clear that some of the U.S. recent cases were mental health problems.
So and unfortunately what that does is make it very difficult to devise strategies that will address all of the cases that we might encounter.
Yeah. Last question.
My name is Yaya Fanusi. I'm with United States of Africa 2017 Project Task Force. Came to this country in 1967, and I always tell Americans, as well as government officials that I meet, if you don't go stop interfering in areas where the people don't look like you, you'll be all right.
Well, thank you for that advice. Nick, I really, on behalf of Ambassador Chamberlain and the MEI team, Kate and Paul and everybody here, can't thank you enough for coming and spending a time. We've been up here an hour, but it means by the time you get back to the office, it will have been 3 or 4 hours off work. And I was serious when I said, I know that means you're going to be there late tonight because I know how tough the job is. I did it for 10 years. You've now done it for 15. I don't know how you do it. I just, on behalf of the American people, really want to thank you.
Thank you, Dick.